Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been in practice for 25 years, working with thousands of patients. And this channel is my opportunity to share a variety of resources with you to help you thrive. So, in today's video, I'm going to talk about a gift that your future self would like to give you and how to collect it. Okay, so in today's video, I'm going to tell you how to collect a very valuable gift from your future self. And watch to the end because I'm also going to tell you about a strategy to pay that back and give a gift to your future self. Okay? So we humans have big brains, and one feature of our big brains is that we're able to model hypothetical realities that don't actually exist. It's why the research scientist Daniel Goleman once said, Ben& Jerry's ice cream will never have to test market liver and onions flavor ice cream because we all already know the answer. We can instantly model that future reality in our heads and know what it's going to be like. Now, sometimes that works against us because sometimes we overestimate the amount of misery we think we're going to experience from a future event, or we overestimate the amount of joy that a future event might produce. And we make decisions based on a misguided expectation about misery or pleasure. But I'll come back to that and talk about that in a different video. But in this video, I'm going to talk about a way to use your big brain in modeling complex realities and kind of stepping out of time in a specific way to help you with a complicated situation in your life that you might be experiencing now or that you might experience at some point in the future. Okay? So, one of the issues with complicated situations that are stressful is that we may not see a path through the situation. And this is something that patients talk with me about all the time in therapy because people come to therapy sometimes for frank psychiatric issues like I'm anxious. But once you start talking about what people are anxious about, it's almost always the case that people are anxious about existential issues. So, life problems, facing complicated transitions and changes in life, and trying to decide how to move forward through a complex situation, right? So, for example, someone might think, oh my God, I just lost my job and I've done 3 interviews. I'm not sure I like any of the jobs that I'm interviewing for. And so, should I take one or should I keep putting out applications? So, people face complex life situations like that all the time. And I'm sure that you have as well. So, one strategy for finding a way through an issue, and by finding a way through, I mean both on the practical level in terms of navigating the choice points in an evolving situation in ways that get optimal results, including that later, at whatever point later in time, one result we want from any situation is we want to later be able to look backward and be satisfied with how we navigated the situation at the time, right? So like today, I want to be able to look back 6 months ago to some situation that I dealt with and not regret how I dealt with it back then, regardless of the outcome. I want to be satisfied with myself about how I got through it, right? So this strategy is about both kind of sorting out how am I going to make careful choices to deal with the practical level of a complex situation, but also I want to emotionally, psychologically navigate it in a way that's optimal, both how I get through it and both how I'm going to think about it later, all right? So here's the strategy. You take your life situation and you're going to devote three 15-minute sessions over 3 days to address this. And what you're going to do is you're going to set aside 15 minutes and you're going to get a notebook and a pen, or if you prefer typing online, then open up a document on your computer and type this. But what you're going to do is you're going to write a narrative. The narrative is a letter from yourself to yourself. But the self who is writing the letter is positioned in time at least 6 months into the future. So you might go like this, it's winter right now. I might actually situate myself in fall, let's say, of this year. So I'm 3 seasons ahead, and but at some significant point, several months to a year ahead in time. And what I'm going to do is I sit down with my paper and I say, "Hey, John." So I'm writing to John, which means the John of now, okay? But it's the John from the future who's writing the letter, right? So I'm the John of the future. I'm saying, "Hey, John, look, I know several months ago that you were dealing with this issue, and it was confusing and stressful and overwhelming, and this was going on and that was going on. So you don't have to get into super rich detail because both your present you and your future you actually know what you're talking about, right? So you make references that are meaningful in naming the features of the issue, but you don't necessarily have to say, okay, here's all of what you were thinking at the time or all of what you were experiencing, right? So you're saying, hey, I know that, back then, writing from the future, referring to now, you were dealing with the fact that your house just burned down and you didn't have any idea of what you were going to do about it, or whatever the situation is, right? So your future self writes this note and says, "Hey, look, you were dealing with this, and it had this, that, and the other problems with it. You weren't sure how to deal with it. You were feeling overwhelmed. You're feeling frustrated. Maybe those around you, those connected with you, were also reacting to the situation, and you were thinking about this, that, and the other thing in terms of trying to deal with it. And maybe this part was really super sucky, right?" So basically a snapshot of the thing you're referring to. So that's the first part of what you write. Okay. The second part of what you write in this narrative is you say, so here's what happened. And what you do is you create a scenario where you just lay out one possible way that the situation evolved. So this happened and then that happened. So let's say it's looking for a job because you got fired. Okay, so you got fired, you were upset, you were worried about how you're going to pay the bills, you were worried about getting evicted, you were putting in applications. And so what happened was you put in some applications and you got this job, and it was an okay job. It was paying the bills, but it wasn't really the perfect job because it didn't quite pay enough, and it was not too boring, but not that exciting. And so you decided to stick with it for a few months. And so you stayed in that job. And while you stayed in that job, you decided to put in other applications to try to find a better job to trade up. And while you were doing that, you talked to a therapist for a few sessions, or you talked to some of your friends to get some support. And you also decided that because you were so stressed out that you're a little too much of a slug. And so you decided to exercise a little more, and you did an okay job with that, nothing heroic. But you also maybe made some diet changes and you started taking care of yourself. And so you're laying out a hypothetical scenario of how that original situation evolved, and you're just making up some random things, okay? And then the last part of the narrative is saying, so you got through that. It was not the greatest. These parts kind of sucked, but these parts made it work. And these are some of the things that you did to get through that. Okay. So, first part of the narrative, you name the situation. Second part, you give a hypothetical of just making up a story about how the thing evolved, right? And the third part is you name some things that kind of sucked about it, but also some things that actually worked to make it evolve in the way that you wrote in the middle part. Okay. Now, the reason that I ask my patients to do 3 of these writings rather than just one is if you only do one of these, what your brain will do is try to filter the writing and carefully construct it in order to make it super feasible and even to make it a kind of plan, right? So I'm the John now. I'm writing from my future self to me now. And it's natural to have the urge to say, well, what I'm really writing is how this is going to work out. What I'm really writing is how I'm actually going to make specific choices to make it work out. But that's not the purpose of this exercise, because the middle section of the narrative, where you just lay out a hypothetical way that the situation evolved, I don't want you to think of that as a plan to which you get committed. Because if it's a plan to which you're going to have to commit, that means you're only going to have to write that narrative as a feasible one with features that have choices that you would actually make. And that's not the purpose of the writing. The purpose of this writing is not to brainstorm and then come up with a plan that you're actually going to implement and follow in order to achieve any particular set of outcomes for the difficult situation. The reason that we do this exercise is because we're going to open up our mind to just seeing possibilities. And we also want to use the hypothetical, which is the middle part of the narrative, in order to allow us to be in touch with our inner capacities and strengths and ability to cope. Because what happens is when people create this type of narrative, part of what is explicit and more often implicit in the narrative, if I go read somebody's narrative after giving them this type of assignment, part of what I'm going to see in that narrative is that they have included strengths. Because, I mean, even on the existential level, at the most fundamental level, if I'm writing to myself from the future, that means whatever situation I was facing now didn't kill me. I survived, right? So if I'm writing John in fall of 2023 to John in the middle winter of 2023, and I say, hey, John, you faced that difficult situation. This happened, that happened, and here you are, you made it to fall. Even if that's all I write, implicit in that narrative is you got through it, okay? Now, if we back up and say, why write the narrative in the first place? Often when people are really stressed out, confused, and overwhelmed with a situation, part of what's threatened is even the fundamental sense that I'm going to get through this, right? So if you think about just that aspect of how that narrative can function to reinforce that sense of the capacity that you can cope with it regardless of how it's going to evolve and what you're going to do to cope. We need to be in touch with that. That's part of the golden gift of this exercise, is taking some of that sense of that capacity of being able to cope and having coped from your future self and beaming it into your current self so your current self can have a richer sense of, actually, this is not going to kill me. It's difficult. I'm not sure how it's going to work out, but I am going to get through this. That narrative from the future self is full of implicit references to the ability to cope. So that's part of the value. And that's also why I don't want you to see it as just, I'm going to write down a plan of how I'm going to deal with this and then commit to that plan. And that's why we do it 3 times. So day 1, you write the narrative. Day 2, you write a different narrative. And the different narrative might have a different middle section with a different hypothetical situation in terms of explaining how the situation evolved and what you did to cope with it, right? Day 3, you do it again and you write another narrative, and that one's going to have a different middle section, a different hypothetical about what happened and what you did to respond to it. So if you do that 3 times, that helps your brain unhook from seeing it as, I need to accurately predict how it's actually going to evolve, and I need to define a plan that I actually commit to respond to the situation to make it work out a certain way, right? We're not doing that, and that's why we do it 3 times, right? 3 different narratives that have 3 different scenarios of how it evolves and what you do to cope with it, because all 3 of those are going to include implicit references to your inner strengths and your ability to cope, right? So try this at home, either now if you're facing a difficult situation in your life, or at some point in the future, you're facing a difficult situation. What you want to do is get a notebook or a document, and on 3 days, you're going to devote 15 minutes to sit down and write that narrative where part one is just name the situation that you're talking about. Part two is here's a hypothetical way that that whole thing evolved and what you did to respond to different parts of that evolving situation. And then number three, okay, so it evolved that way. You did these things, and here's where you ended up. Okay, that's the narrative, right? So you do it 3 different times, and then you can throw it away if you want, because the purpose is really not to create a document that's an artifact that we're going to use in a particular way. It's an exercise to get your mind in that mode of I can cope with this, and here are different parts of myself that can come to bear to help me cope with this. So that's one way to get a gift from your future self. So if you like this kind of content, hit the like below. If you like this channel, feel very free to subscribe. If you have comments, I welcome comments because they help me understand how my videos are landing on people, and they give me ideas about future videos as well. But here's another bonus tip. If you want to give your future self some gold, then you want to behave now in a way that your future self is going to be satisfied with later. I think this is a good general guide because our positive emotions in our life, and Martin Seligman, who's the father of positive psychology, has talked about this in interviews and in his books. Deep satisfaction in life comes from not only positive emotion in the present, but positive emotion that's oriented toward the future and positive emotion that's oriented toward the past. So, for example, if I have anticipation and hope, that's positivity oriented toward the future. If I'm eating a hot fudge sundae and I say, this is scrumptious, that's positive experience in the now. And if I say toward the past, I'm proud of what I did last week. I'm really satisfied with how I dealt with that situation. That's past-oriented positivity, right? The only way to have past-oriented positivity is to behave in the now so that our future self can look backward in time and be happy with the past, right? So one way to give your future self some gold is some of the time to think about how do I act in the present so that later I'm going to be happy with this, right? So this kind of relates a little bit to the videos I made recently about shame and guilt. How can you avoid later feeling shame and guilt? Well, behave in the present so it's less likely that you feel shame and guilt in the future, to the extent that we're talking about situations that you can control. All right, so thanks for joining me on this video today, and I will see you soon in another video.